Welcome, fellow seeker of ingenuity. Tonight I speak with the voice of one who has witnessed the marriage of magic and mechanism, who has stood among impossible inventions, where brass gears turn with arcane purpose and crystalline sensors detect what mortal eyes cannot see. This chronicle unfolds in depths where ever-burning flames cast shadows across workbenches lined with devices that blur the line between magic and engineering. It is the tale of the Artificer's workshop, where a brilliant mind discovers that the most ancient evils can be countered not with sword or spell alone, but with systematic analysis, mechanical precision, and the revolutionary idea that magic itself can be disrupted through the principles of engineering. In the depths of Mount Waterdeep, where the city's underground chambers connected to natural caverns that had never seen sunlight, Artificer Nim Brightforge worked by the light of ever-burning torches and magical flames that cast dancing shadows across workshop walls lined with impossible inventions. The air here was thick with the scent of metal shavings and alchemical reagents, while the constant sound of ticking clockwork and humming magical fields created a symphony of innovation that spoke of a mind always in motion, always reaching toward the next breakthrough that might change the world. Her latest project was spread across multiple workbenches, components of a device that could, if her calculations were correct, detect and disrupt the magical energies that powered the cult's communication networks across vast distances. The apparatus resembled nothing so much as a mechanical spider crossed with an astrolabe, its brass and steel components gleaming with the kind of precision that marked Nim as one of the most skilled artificers of her generation. Someone whose understanding of the intersection between magic and mechanism had pushed the boundaries of what most people considered possible. Nim had always been considered eccentric, even by the standards of her profession, a guild known for attracting individuals whose minds worked in ways that conventional people found difficult to understand. While other artificers focused on creating magical items that enhanced individual abilities, swords that never dulled, armor that turned aside the strongest blows, rings that granted their wearers supernatural insight, she was obsessed with understanding the underlying principles that made magic work in the first place. Her workshop was filled with devices that most people would consider useless. Instruments that measured magical field density with microscopic precision. Apparatus that could separate different types of magical energy into their component parts. Contraptions that recorded and analyzed the patterns of spellcasting with the thoroughness of a scholar studying ancient texts. But her research had revealed something that traditional wizards and clerics had missed in their focus on individual magical achievement. The cult's magical operations followed patterns that were more mechanical than mystical, more systematic than inspired. Their spells were not the inspired works of individual creativity that marked most magical practice, but standardized procedures carried out with industrial efficiency by practitioners who had been trained to follow specific protocols rather than develop their own techniques. This suggested that their magic could be countered using engineering principles rather than arcane theory, disrupted through systematic interference rather than matched through superior spellcasting ability. The device she was building, she had dubbed it the Thaumic Resonance Disruptor in the detailed notes that filled dozens of journals scattered around her workshop, would exploit weaknesses in the cult's magical infrastructure that they probably didn't know existed. If she could complete it in time, and if her theories proved correct when tested against real-world conditions, she might be able to give the forces of good an advantage that could tip the balance of the entire conflict in ways that no army or alliance of heroes could achieve alone. The theoretical foundation for her work had come from months of studying reports from across the continent, analyzing patterns in the cult's activities that had escaped the notice of more conventional investigators who focused on obvious manifestations of their power rather than the subtle systems that made such manifestations possible. While others focused on the dramatic aspects of their operations, the raids that terrorized communities, the recruitment drives that swelled their ranks, the accumulation of treasure that funded their activities, Nim had been fascinated by the logistics that made such widespread coordination possible. How do they manage it? She had asked herself during one of the late-night sessions that had become her norm, surrounded by charts and diagrams that mapped the cult's activities across time and space. How does a cult with cells scattered across dozens of kingdoms maintain the kind of precise coordination that their operations require? How do they synchronize activities that span vast distances and involve thousands of individual actors? The answer, when it came to her through a combination of careful analysis and intuitive leap, had been both elegant and obvious. The cult was using magical communication networks based on the same principles that powered sending stones and similar artifacts, but modified to operate on a much larger scale and with much greater efficiency than anything that individual spellcasters could achieve. They had created a magical equivalent of the communication systems that allowed merchant guilds to coordinate activities across vast distances, but adapted for military and religious purposes that required even greater precision and reliability. But, unlike natural magical phenomena, which operated according to principles that were often chaotic and unpredictable, artificial communication networks had systematic vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who understood their underlying structure. They required regular maintenance to function properly, careful calibration to avoid interference from other magical sources, and protection from various forms of disruption that could render them unreliable or completely useless. Most importantly, they operated on specific magical frequencies that could be identified, analyzed, and potentially jammed by someone with the right equipment and sufficient understanding of the principles involved. Nim's workshop contained the fruits of years spent developing that understanding, a collection of devices and instruments that would have seemed like sorcery to most observers, but represented the cutting edge of magical engineering. Arrays of crystalline sensors that could detect magical emanations from miles away, their faceted surfaces catching and analyzing energy patterns with precision that exceeded the capabilities of the most sensitive human magical senses. Mechanical calculators, powered by carefully controlled magical fields, capable of processing complex equations involving multidimensional magical theory faster than any human mind could follow. Alchemical apparatus that could synthesize magical reagents with precision that exceeded anything achieved through traditional methods, creating substances whose properties were tailored to specific applications rather than discovered through trial and error. But the centerpiece of her collection was the prototype communication interceptor she had constructed to test her theories about the cult's network. The device looked like something that belonged in an astrologer's laboratory, crossed with a clockmaker's workshop. Its multiple brass dials and crystal lenses arranged according to principles that combined mechanical engineering with magical theory, in ways that no traditional artificer would have attempted. The result was something that operated according to rules that seemed to violate both conventional magic and conventional mechanics, yet somehow produced results that neither could achieve alone. The interceptor had proven her theories correct in spectacular fashion. By carefully tuning its sensors to the magical frequencies used by cult communications, she had been able to monitor their message traffic for weeks without their knowledge, building up a detailed picture of their operations that revealed patterns and vulnerabilities that no amount of conventional intelligence gathering could have uncovered. What she had learned from that monitoring had both thrilled and terrified her, providing confirmation that her approach was sound while revealing the true scope of the threat they faced. The cult's communication network was vast beyond anything she had imagined, connecting cells in every major city and town across the known world with a level of integration that spoke of careful planning and massive investment. Their message traffic revealed a level of coordination that would have impressed the generals of major armies, with resources being moved and operations being planned according to a timeline that stretched months into the future and involved contingencies for scenarios that most military planners would never have considered. But most importantly, the intercepted communications had revealed the existence of key nodes in the network. Locations where multiple communication lines converged and where disrupting the equipment would have effects far beyond the immediate area. If she could build devices capable of not just monitoring, but actively jamming these nodes, she might be able to blind the cult's leadership to the activities of their scattered forces, creating opportunities for resistance movements that, had been previously crushed by the cult's superior intelligence and coordination. The Thaumic Resonance Disruptor was designed to do exactly that. But building such a device required solving engineering challenges that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with available magical theory. Unlike her passive monitoring equipment, this device would actively broadcast magical interference on the frequencies used by cult communications, creating effects similar to shouting so loudly in a crowded room that no one could hear normal conversation. The technical challenges were staggering. The power requirements alone demanded energy sources typically reserved for major magical workings, while the targeting systems needed to focus interference precisely enough to disrupt enemy communications without affecting friendly magical activities. Nim's solution to the power problem had come from her study of how magical energy was stored and released in nature, leading her to design a system that tapped into existing magical fields rather than trying to generate the massive amounts of power the disruptor required. The device would function like a magical lens, concentrating and focusing ambient magical energy rather than creating it from nothing, making it both more efficient and less detectable than conventional magical devices. The targeting problem had required her to develop entirely new methods for analyzing and categorizing magical signatures, creating what amounted to a library of cult communication patterns that could be used to distinguish their activities from the background noise of other magical activities. Each type of magical communication had its own distinctive pattern, like a fingerprint that could be identified and isolated from other sources, allowing the disruptor to target only those specific patterns while leaving other magic untouched. Portability had been achieved through modular construction that allowed the disruptor to be broken down into components that could be transported separately and assembled in the field. Each module was designed to function independently if necessary, providing backup capabilities in case parts of the system were damaged or destroyed during deployment, while also allowing for different configurations depending on the specific requirements of each mission. As Nim worked on the final calibrations of her prototype, adjusting the delicate balance between power output and targeting precision that would determine whether the device succeeded in its intended purpose or simply created a magical explosion that would level half of Waterdeep, she was joined by an unexpected visitor. Laeral Silverhand, the open lord of Waterdeep herself, descended into the workshop with the kind of quiet grace that marked her as someone comfortable with both political power and personal danger. Artificer Brightforge, Laerel said, studying the complex apparatus with eyes that held centuries of magical experience and the kind of analytical intelligence that had made her one of the most effective leaders in Waterdeep's history. I've been hearing fascinating reports about your work. Something about a device that could disrupt enemy communications across vast distances? The reports may have been somewhat exaggerated, Nim replied carefully, uncertain how much detail she should share with someone whose political position required her to consider factors beyond simple technical feasibility. But yes, I believe I've developed methods that could significantly interfere with the cult's ability to coordinate their operations across the distances involved in their current activities. Laerel moved closer to examine the disruptor's components, her expression showing the kind of professional interest that one expert craftsman showed for another's work. The careful way she studied the device's construction revealed an understanding of magical engineering that went far beyond what most political leaders possessed, suggesting that her interest was more than merely administrative. Impressive engineering, she observed, running her fingers along the edge of one of the targeting arrays with the delicate touch of someone who understood how easily such devices could be damaged by careless handling. I'm not familiar with some of these components. Are they your own innovations? Most of them, yes, Nim admitted, finding herself drawn into the kind of technical discussion that she rarely had the opportunity to enjoy with someone who could truly understand the complexities involved. Traditional magical theory assumes that communication spells are too individualized to be disrupted systematically, but the cult's network operates more like a mechanical system than a collection of personal magical abilities. That makes it vulnerable to the kind of systematic interference that mechanical systems are susceptible to. The demonstration that followed lasted for over an hour, with Nim explaining the theoretical foundations of her work, while Laerel asked the kind of probing questions that tested both technical understanding and practical applicability. By the end of the session, it was clear that the Open Lord understood not just what the disruptor could do, but why it represented a potentially decisive advantage in the conflict with the cult. How many of these devices could you construct? Laerel asked as the demonstration concluded, her mind already moving toward the practical questions of deployment and resource allocation that would determine whether Nim's breakthrough could be translated into strategic advantage. That depends on several factors, Nim replied, her engineering mind immediately jumping to the practical challenges involved in scaling up production from prototype to operational deployment. Magical components are rare and expensive, requiring materials that are difficult to obtain in large quantities. The precision work requires skills that most artificers don't possess, making it difficult to train assistants who could handle the routine assembly work. And each device needs to be individually calibrated for the specific magical environment where it will be deployed. What would you need to begin production immediately? Laerel asked, her tone carrying the kind of decision-making authority that could mobilize the resources of an entire city-state. Funding for materials, access to a larger workshop with better equipment, and perhaps most importantly, a team of assistants who can handle the routine assembly work while I focus on the complex calibrations that require my personal attention. Nim replied, already envisioning the expanded operation that would be necessary to produce enough disruptors to have strategic impact. Laerel nodded, her expression showing the kind of decision-making process that had made her one of the most effective leaders in Waterdeep's history. You'll have whatever you need. This technology could change the entire nature of our conflict with the cult, but only if we can deploy it before they complete whatever they're planning. The weeks that followed transformed Nim's quiet workshop into something resembling a military production facility, with artificers and engineers from across Waterdeep recruited to assist with the construction of multiple disruptor units. The city's resources were mobilized to obtain the rare materials and components that the devices required, while intelligence agents provided the targeting information that would allow the disruptors to be deployed where they could have maximum impact. The cult's communication network had been mapped in detail through weeks of careful monitoring, revealing the location of major nodes and the patterns of message traffic that connected them. With this information, Nim could optimize each device for the specific frequencies and magical signatures used in its target area, ensuring that the interference would be both effective and difficult for the cult to counter. The first field test came sooner than anyone had expected, when intelligence reports revealed that the cult was planning a major operation that would require extensive coordination between cells in multiple cities. Rather than attempting to counter the operation directly through military means, Waterdeep's forces would use Nim's disruptors to blind the cult's leadership to what was happening in the field, turning their own efficiency against them. The results exceeded even Nim's optimistic projections. Within hours of activating the disruptor network, cult communications across the entire region had been reduced to chaos. Operations that required precise timing fell apart when orders couldn't be transmitted. Resources that were supposed to be moved to specific locations remained stranded in their original positions, and field commanders found themselves operating without guidance from their superiors, forced to make decisions based on incomplete information and outdated plans. Most importantly, the cult's leadership seemed unable to determine what was causing their communication problems. The disruptors operated by manipulating natural magical fields rather than generating obvious artificial interference, making it difficult for enemy mages to identify and counter their effects. From the cult's perspective, their communication network had simply begun failing randomly, with no clear pattern or explanation for the disruption. But Nim's success also brought new challenges and responsibilities. The effectiveness of her devices made them high-priority targets for cult retaliation, requiring security measures that protected both the equipment and the people who operated it. The complexity of the technology meant that only a small number of artificers could maintain and repair the devices when they were damaged or disrupted by enemy action. Most challenging of all, the cult began adapting their own methods in response to the interference, developing new communication techniques that were harder to detect and disrupt. The technological war that emerged was fought with innovations and countermeasures that pushed both sides to develop capabilities they had never needed before. The cult invested heavily in magical research aimed at creating communication methods that could not be jammed, while Nim and her team worked to stay ahead of their adaptations with improved detection methods and more sophisticated interference techniques. As autumn gave way to winter, it became clear that the disruptor network had fundamentally changed the nature of the conflict. The cult's advantage in coordination and strategic planning had been largely neutralized, forcing them to rely more heavily on local initiative and less on centralized control. This made their operations less predictable, but also less effective, creating opportunities for the forces opposing them to achieve tactical victories that would have been impossible under previous conditions. But Nim understood that technological advantages were temporary by nature. The cult's researchers were intelligent and well-funded, and they would eventually develop methods for countering or bypassing her innovations. The disruptor network had bought valuable time and created tactical opportunities, but it was not a permanent solution to the threat that the cult represented. The real value of her work might lie not in the specific devices she had created, but in the principles and methods that could be applied to future challenges. She had proven that the cult's magical operations could be understood and countered through systematic analysis and engineering innovation, demonstrating that the forces of good could match their enemies' sophistication while maintaining the moral principles that made victory worth achieving. As winter deepened and reports arrived of the cult's growing desperation in the face of their communication difficulties, Nim continued her work in the depths of Mount Waterdeep. New projects crowded her expanded workshop: devices for detecting magical corruption, apparatus for analyzing and countering mind control effects, and systems for protecting important locations from magical assault. The Artificer's workshop had become the birthplace of a new kind of warfare, where victory would be determined not just by courage and magical power, but by innovation and the willingness to challenge conventional assumptions about what was possible. In the depths of the mountains, surrounded by the tools and devices that were reshaping the conflict, Nim Brightforge worked toward a future where technology and wisdom could triumph over ancient evil and its modern methods. The steampunk revolution had come to the war against the cult of the dragon, and its mechanical heartbeat echoed through the caverns with the promise of victories yet to be won. And so, this tale draws to a close. Though its echoes may linger in your dreams, the fire burns lower now. But don't despair. I've countless more stories waiting to be shared with you. If this tale stirred something within you, if it reminded you why magic still matters in this mundane world, then please light your own beacon. That glowing thumbs up tells the spirits of story that our fellowship grows stronger. Subscribe to join our circle permanently and ring that notification bell. That way, you'll know the moment I return with new chronicles. The fire burns brightest when more souls gather around it. Wouldn't you agree? Now, if that's the case, share this tale with another weary soul who needs it, reminding them adventure still exists. Tag a friend who would appreciate a good story by the fire. The more who believe, the more real these worlds become. And if you're new to our hearth, explore the playlist of chronicles that I've gathered. Tales of heroes and villains, love and loss, magic and mystery, each one carefully chosen for souls like yours. Until the fire calls us together again, may your own adventures be worthy of legend, and may you never lose the wonder that brought you here tonight. Travel or sleep well, brave soul. The long rest awaits your return.